Excellent. Thanks, Ian. And welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. As Ian was saying, my name is Jeremy Pittman. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Waterloo. Been out here a couple of years now. Before that, was based in Saskatchewan. Grew up out there on a grain farm. Um, and so a lot of my research that I'm still doing is sort of related to how can we create policies, incentives, instruments, stuff like that that can actually help us do grassland and species at risk conservation out on the prairies. So the work that I'm going to present to you here today, it's entitled Policy Instruments and Incentives for Conservation on Working Landscapes. It's work that I started under the Libre Fellowship Program as a postdoc, but I've since continued in my faculty position with a grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Um, and yeah, it's essentially, at the core of what we were trying to do, we're trying to figure out what types of policy instruments and incentives, and I'll get into a little bit more in a minute what those actually mean. But anyways, what types of instruments and incentives do people actually want out there to do grassland conservation, grassland and species areas conservation? So bear with me here, just get the slides to move. There we go. So essentially, when we're in the context of working landscapes, and again by working landscapes I mean just these landscapes that we use to support biodiversity, support wildlife, support species at risk, but they're also landscapes that have kind of a livelihood component to them as well. So there's some kind of human use. If you look kind of broadly about what encompasses a working landscape, sometimes there's sort of like forests and that type of thing. But in the context I'll be speaking to you today, referring more to like in an agricultural context where you have ranchers and farmers that are, stewarding the land, but also using it to earn a livelihood, produce food, that type of thing. So in these contexts, when we're trying to figure out how to do conservation, usually start off by setting some kind of conservation goals. This could be, protecting critical habitat for species at risk or something like that. In order to achieve that goal, we usually develop some kind of conservation program. And when we're talking about conservation programs here, the way that we kind of broke them down, this was based on some conversations with ECCC and just other people working in this space. We sort of separated a conservation program into two key components. The first was like the policy instrument, and that is essentially, you can almost think about it as like the broad kind of overarching approach that you're taking to conservation. I'll define these a little bit more in detail in a minute, but what we mean by that are things like, are we interested in like purchasing private lands for conservation, or are we more trying to work with existing landowners to do conservation on their land? So those are some examples that kind of show, demonstrate what an instrument is. It's sort of this overarching kind of like almost paradigm or approach that's informing conservation. And the other part are the incentives. So incentives are kind of the, they fit within the instruments, and they're kind of the different ways that we make people want to participate in the program. The most common type, or the most kind of well-known type of incentive, is obviously kind of a financial or economic incentive where someone's receiving a payment or something like that to do conservation. But incentives can be pretty broad. The other one that we'll speak a little bit to in a bit are legal incentives, legal assurances, and those are essentially different ways that in this case, participation in a program might be able to provide you a little bit of legal backing, I guess, or keep you from litigation or something like that through participation in the programs. So I'll define those in more detail in a minute, but that's kind of generally what we were thinking about when we're talking about instruments and incentives. Instruments are kind of the overarching paradigm or approach to conservation, and the incentives are the pieces of the policy that make people actually want to participate. One of the key factors that kind of moderates this relationship, though, are basically, our ability to meet our conservation goals when we are employing conservation programs, is this whole idea of social acceptance, or how much are people actually going to want to participate in this program. That's sort of a key piece of the puzzle that will influence the success of our programs, the ability to kind of reach our conservation goals. And what we were trying to do with this research is figure out, kind of work on this part of the equation a little bit, but essentially figure out which of these instruments and incentives people seem to want the most, which will hopefully help us achieve our conservation goals more effectively and efficiently. So the context, you all that are, anybody joining probably is familiar with this, but the context that we did the survey in, mostly focused in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, but we also sent it out to some ranchers in British Columbia as well. And what this map is showing is based on the Agriculture Ag-Foods Canada cropland inventory. It's basically just showing the native grass layers that's in the dark green there, as well as the tame grass or and forage layers, which is sort of the lighter green. This just gives you a sense of where some of the bigger patches of grass are still located. And that, of course, a lot of species at risk, a lot of different wildlife depend on these patches of grass for their existence, essentially. As we've kind of, over the last 100 so years, where we've been sort of modifying the landscape out there, some species have been able to adapt to those changes, some haven't. And the ones that haven't are really dependent on these big patches of grass that are left. This will give you a sense of kind of where it's distributed. I would also mention quickly, one of the main limitations of this data set is sometimes it misclassifies tame grass as native and potentially vice versa as well. There's some interesting work. Ryan Fisher from Ministry of Environment in Saskatchewan has done some really interesting work with LiDAR down around this portion of Saskatchewan, where they've actually, they've flown over these patches that we thought were native grass before, but the LiDAR is showing furrows in it and stuff like that. So it's obviously probably been lands that were restored after the dirty 30s or something like that and had been at one point cultivated. So, even some of these areas that we think are native right now might not be fully native in sort of a holistic sense. So my research design and methods, basically what we did to collect data. We had these two overarching research questions. I mentioned the first one previously, which essentially what types of policy instruments and incentives do people actually want. So, we were asking them to rank their preferences and that types of things for different options. I'll get into the options a little bit more in a minute here. But yeah, essentially that was our overarching question to say, like, if we want to advance grassland species at risk conservation, how can we develop the instruments and the incentives that people will actually want to participate in? The second thing that the second research question that we tackled to some degree was this idea of, we're not necessarily starting from scratch right now, and there's been programs out there for a long time that have been trying to achieve this. And we wanted to say, like, what sort of things have these programs achieved, more from a social standpoint, where we're thinking about, how much do people perceive that their participation in these previous programs actually influence their practices, or how has it changed the way that they see the environmental value of their farm and ranch. So those are the two things that we're looking at in that regard. We weren't able to kind of target any specific programs for evaluation. So it's not like a very in-depth evaluation of a specific program, but it's more thinking across a suite of programs that have been out there. What sort of changes or it's kind of a self-reported element. How do people see that this has kind of affected them? What sort of impact do they see it having, right? Just to give you a sense, so we asked them what programs they were talking about, and it included a broad range of things. SARPAL, Species Partnership in Agricultural Lands, came up. Habitat Stewardship Program came up, but Operation Burrowing Owl, some Ducks Unlimited work before. It was kind of a broad suite of programs that was captured there. The way that we gathered our data, we did online surveys with landowners. Overall, we got about 231 usable responses. I think I had about 350 clicks or so, but about 231 of those were, complete and usable for the most part. You'll see as I go through question by question, the numbers change a little bit based on how many people completed the questions properly. But overall, there's about 231. Just give you kind of rough sense of the breakdown. BC, we only got 10, so we didn't get a lot of response from BC. Alberta and Saskatchewan, we got pretty good, about 49, 64 respectively. And Manitoba was kind of a medium response. We got about 22. I should also note, though, that as you're all probably aware, sometimes, sometimes people don't want to tell you about where they're from, and that's totally fine. Understandable in a lot of cases. And so we had about 86 that didn't report the province they were from. So we've included them in the analysis here, but we haven't necessarily tied them to any province or thing like that. Bear with me one sec. There we go. And just to note quickly here, about 34% of the respondents had previously participated in species areas conservation programs. So that's important information for that second point there, where we're talking about thinking about the impact of the existing programs. So about 34% of our respondents had been in programs before. Yeah, so digging in a little bit more on the policy instruments that we focused on, and if you can imagine, you know, the entire universe or the entire suite of instruments that we could have tackled is pretty big, but we chose to focus on four in particular, and this was through consultation with ECCC, Canadian Cattlemen, Saskatchewan Stock Growers, you know, just a broad range of groups we chatted with when we were developing this survey to make sure that we had instruments that were sort of, you know, either they had been being used out there for a while, they're kind of being experimented with at the moment, or they had like some potential to be used in the future. Yeah, and the ones that we chose, some of these probably look familiar, but we looked at conservation easements. You're all probably familiar with that one, but that's essentially where there's some sort of restriction placed on the title of land. So a very common one that we use is no break, no drain. So that's basically if a landowner wants to engage in that type of conservation easement, they something goes on the title for that deeded land that basically says that the landowner can no longer break it, which means convert grass to crops or something like that, or drain the wetlands on it. It's a fairly common one. The next one we called land securement, and that's essentially when a private landowner will sell their property or their land to an organization for the purposes of conservation. Sometimes land securement actually refers to easements and the buying and selling of land together, but we separated them in the survey just to add a bit of resolution there to our analysis, just to kind of separate them to get people's perceptions on each one separately. The next one is maybe a bit of a newer one, essentially conservation management agreements. Those can be pretty broad, but it's essentially, you know, it involves potentially somebody from a conservation organization, you know, South of Divide Conservation Action Program or Cows and Fish or Multisar or something like that, Manitoba Habitat Heritage Corporation, going out and meeting with a landowner, sitting down, you know, at the kitchen table or walking around with them on their land, and trying to develop maybe a plan for management that helps the landowner sort of, you know, manage their lands a little bit more for habitat for a certain species or for a certain mix of species or something like that. It can also include what's typically called a results-based agreement. So these have been sort of operating in Saskatchewan for the last few years, in Southwest Saskatchewan. And what that is essentially when somebody from, in this case, South of Divide Conservation Action Program goes out at the beginning of the season, does sort of a habitat assessment. If the lands kind of pass a threshold of habitat, so it's basically saying that there's habitat there for a certain species, the landowner is able to enroll in the program. You know, sod cap goes away for the entire season. They come back at the end after the land's been grazed or used. However, if that habitat is still there, it triggers a payment to the landowner. So it's a very non-prescriptive approach. Essentially, the idea of it being results-based or outcome-based essentially means that the landowner is paid for the habitat that results, or the habitat as an outcome. The next one that we talked about was market certification, and that's essentially where there's some sort of verifiable standards, usually by a third party or something like that. That sort of, in this case, would set up, you know, the standards for participation in the program would be related to meeting some kind of habitat targets or something like that. And if those are met, just kind of this third party verification and I guess confirmation that this producer's lands are, you know, benefiting conservation in some way, and then that provides a means for that landowner or that producer to kind of interact with the market. There's a lot of different ways that this could play out. It could be like, you know, a logo that they're able to like pop on their products at the local farmers market, or it could be just access to, you know, a different type of value chain, something like that. And this is one that's kind of emerging as potentially being important. You probably heard before Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. That's one example of this kind of market certification process that potentially has a lot of potential to advance conservation in the future. So in terms of incentives, again, the entire kind of suite of incentives is or had potential in this area. So the first one, I know this one before, but that's essentially legal assurances. That's some kind of legal protection that can be offered through participation in the program. In the United States, they would typically call this something like a safe harbor agreement. One of the things. Oh, does everybody still have me here? Can everybody still hear me? I'm getting a warning about poor network quality.
Yeah, we still hear you.
Okay, perfect. I'll keep going. Yeah, so legal assurances, I mentioned they're sort of like the idea of safe harbors from the US. And that essentially provides the landowner with some kind of legal protection based on them participating in the program or doing something on their landscape. Some of the examples that come up all the time are the whole idea, like, say you were participating in a program for swift fox or ferruginous hawk or something like that. And what you were doing, was supporting those two species, but they ended up impacting the sage grouse or something like that. And in those situations, sometimes producers don't necessarily want to be liable then for having impacted the sage grouse. So these types of agreements can provide some protection in that regard. We didn't get into the details in the survey about how exactly these things could be structured, and there's a lot of different ways that they could be, but we just asked people in general, is this something that they might be interested in terms of pursuing? Do they see it as basically an incentive that they would want? The second one we looked at is market-based premiums. That's related a little bit to that certification idea, but essentially what we mean by premiums is the ability to kind of sell your product for a little bit more when you're doing things that are good for birds or when you're doing things in a conservation-friendly manner. And so that logo that I mentioned before, so if you're at your local farmers market and you have sort of like a bird-friendly beef or a similar type of logo on your package, does that mean that the consumer will pay a little bit more for that? And is that a kind of incentive that people might want? The other one we looked at was cost sharing. That's a fairly common one, been around for a long time. But that's essentially where the costs of doing a certain practice or purchasing materials or something like that is sort of split between the private landowner and the public. So for example, if somebody wants to buy a fence or a remote watering system or something like that, they would put up, maybe half, and the other half would come from a grant from the government or some other entity. The next one was annual payments, and that's essentially where the producer or the landowner is doing something that triggers kind of an annual payment. The example kind of related to that results-based or the outcome-based idea would be, every year, as long as you're able to meet those habitat targets, you get some kind of payment for doing so. That's one example. Annual payments can come in a lot of different forms as well. But that's just one example that's been functioning a little bit out in this area. And we contrasted that a little bit to one-time payments, which would essentially be some sort of payment for avoidance of activities, or payments. A common one in this case is payments for those easements, those restrictions that are being placed on title. So maybe it's something like when you sign up for an easement, no break, no drain, you get 25% or so of fair market value of your land at that time. You'll never get, you're signing away that, I guess those restrictions are on your title forever. But you're not necessarily, you're only getting paid for that once. It's only this type of thing that kind of happens one time or in a lump sum. So those were the 5 that we asked people about to get their sort of like relative preferences for these different ways that these different incentives can be structured. So digging into the results. So the first question there, what instruments and incentives do people actually want? Our first question that we asked them here is, when they're thinking around, when they're sitting at their kitchen table or having their coffee or whatever, and they're thinking about participating in these programs, what types of things are going through their head? What factors are most important to them when they're considering to participate in these programs? So the most important thing that came out was this whole idea of that, the largest concern was the restrictions that participating in the program will place on their farming or ranching operation. So that's kind of the top ranked, I guess, option or factor that people are thinking about when they're considering participating. The next one was the level of trust that they had with the organization delivering the program. So, you know, there's some organizations are really sort of like locally rooted, really closely connected with you know, the local communities, and they've spent a lot of time developing trusting relationships with these communities. And that was one thing that came out as a, you know, a fairly important element that people are thinking about when they're considering participating in these programs. And the last thing was the amount of funding available from the program. You know, and just a quick note on that, I would say, you know, that even though funding was kind of the least ranked or the lowest ranked, it still is a fairly important thing. Like if that funding wasn't there, um, uh, they might not even consider participating in the program in the first place. But you know, so in situations when the funding is there, there are these kind of other things that people are also considering, namely the trust they have for the organization that's sort of interacting with them, and the types of restrictions that it might actually influence their operations. So kind of places the funding relative to these other concerns a little bit. Um, uh, and yeah, it gives us some idea about, you know, as we're kind of rolling out these programs or as we're structuring them, thinking about both the restrictions, but also the who and who's involved could be important parts for, you know, making these things function. This just gives you a sense of how the results were distributed. So with the blue is the funding, the orange is the trust, and the gray is the restrictions. And what this is showing you is just the percentage of people that ranked it most important, middle importance, and then least important. You can kind of see that whenever I look at graphs like this, I'm always interested in like the percentage that's most important, but also least important. So if you know, if the difference between those is big, you can have more kind of confidence in the results, right? So in this case, with 51% ranking restrictions high and only 14 ranking it low, you can be fairly confident that's a robust result, I guess, or just more confident in results like that. Similarly, with 60% ranking funding low and then only 15% ranking high. So those things you can have some more confidence in. The trust one's kind of it's kind of in the middle, right? 35 to 27. So it's important, but sort of in the middle when you think about these things. And the instruments that came out sort of important in order of preference. Number one was conservation management agreements. So again, that's like the habitat management plans or the results-based agreements that people might be working with really closely with some kind of a third-party conservation organization. They're really non-prescriptive. They allow ranchers and farmers kind of pursue conservation in the way that they want. They maintain sort of like private control of the land and all that kind of stuff, so that there's a lot of reasons why these things are probably pretty palatable. Market certification was number two. And again, that's kind of an emerging thing that has a lot of potential to advance conservation in this context. And yeah, it was interesting that it was also ranked high by landowners. It seems to be something that they're interested in pursuing and would like to see more of. Conservation easements was number three. And again, that's where restrictions are placed on title. And land securement was number four. You know, and that kind of makes sense for some reasons, you know, just this whole idea that people want to maintain their independence and control, that type of thing. So yeah, and if you look at these, they're kind of ranked in that order as well, with you know, where people maintain the most control is sort of number one, and least control number four. All that, you know, one note on this as well that I would say is this doesn't necessarily suggest that you want to get rid of any of these. I would I'll get into this more in a minute, but you know, when you think about how you might attract the most people to your conservation programs, you still want a diversity, right? So you want to maintain the options that you have. But this just gives you a sense of where you might place the most emphasis and stuff like that. Not necessarily about getting rid of any of them, but kind of saying like where you might place more or less emphasis. And this just gives you a sense of again how it broke down, kind of most preferred, least preferred. You'll see like conservation management agreements, they're the most preferred by about 60% and least preferred by only about 4%. So that's a fairly robust result. Same with, on the flip side, the securement, least preferred by 64% and only most preferred by about 7%. So those types of large changes are fairly robust, or large differences, I guess, are fairly robust. So the incentives in order of preference, annual payments was number one, cost sharing was number two, market premiums number three, legal assurance is number four, and one-time payments number five. I would note on this one, this just shows the distribution a little bit again, but there was sort of, in a lot of cases, there was less. The agreement was a bit less than for the instruments and the other questions. You'll see like annual payment still comes out fairly strong, 36%. Versus 3%, but in a lot of cases, you know, the differences are a lot closer than some of the other ones. So this again suggests that, you know, the suite of incentives that we want to use should be pretty diverse. But you know, we might think a little bit more about you know, structuring things around an annual payment a little bit more. It seems like a lot of people would prefer that one. You know, maintaining the others or developing the others is probably still a good idea, but you know, we might place a little bit more emphasis on some of these ones that are ranked a little bit more higher. And this, what I was trying to do with this diagram is actually make that point a little bit more clear, and think about how you might actually structure these. Everybody always makes fun of these. It makes fun of me for my diagrams. They call these my molecular structure and all that kind of stuff. But essentially, what I'm trying to show with these diagrams, so the red circles, those are the policy instruments, and the size of the circle is related to the percentage of the time that it was ranked as number one or most preferred. The blue boxes are the incentives, and again, the size is related to how many times they were ranked most preferred. The lines represent the amount of times that in the same survey, for example, conservation management agreements were ranked number one and annual payments were ranked number one. And the thickness of the line represents the percentage of the times that occurred. So basically, places where the lines are really thick show like a tighter connection between these different types of instruments and incentives, which says that, you know, in combination they might be more preferred by different folks. You know, the way you might think about something like this, you notice for conservation management agreements, for example, fairly tightly connected to annual payments and cost sharing. You know, so those could be two things that stay on the table when you're thinking about conservation management agreements, but also like fairly connected to assurances, which is interesting. And assurances again are the legal assurances. So, you know, maybe by participating in these conservation management agreements, there could be, you know, certain options, or if certain conditions were met, maybe that does provide some kind of legal protection to the landowner for various reasons. That could be something that's fairly interesting. The other thing that comes out is, you know, this connection between conservation management agreements and market premiums. So that's an interesting one. And so maybe there's something set up where, you know, participation in a conservation management agreement, if it has sort of like verifiable habitat standards or habitat quality standards or something like that kind of tied to it, maybe that provides a means for landowners to start interacting with the markets a little bit more. Like maybe essentially that's the criteria that kind of gets you access to that logo that you can use at the farmer's market, or access to a different value chain, or something like that. That might be a way of sort of like stacking these incentives that includes market-based premiums within the mix. One-time payments could be important as well, a little bit less so, but still maybe something that you keep on the table. So also, you know, when you think about market certification, there's some interesting that it's really tightly connected to market premiums, so that makes sense. It's also a little bit connected to annual payments, so that might be a little bit of a different mechanism for generating some incentives with certification, a little bit to cost share, and a little bit to the others as well, to give kind of a sense of how this all breaks down. So the last part that I want to talk with you about is that second research question, but thinking a little bit more about impact and additionality of some of the existing programs. And again, it's not an evaluation per se of any particular program, but rather just the suite of programs that have been operating out there for the last few years, which is pretty diverse. But essentially we asked people, so we only asked this to people that had participated in the programs, but we asked them to what extent they think that their participation actually influenced their practices. You'll notice some influence is sort of the highest ranked option. But if you look at, you know, across some influence and strong influence, which are the ones that suggested influence versus no influence, about 80% of the people were perceiving some influence to their management practices. So that's a fairly significant amount. You know, gives a sense that people are perceiving these programs are doing something for their operation, which is a pretty good thing. After they answered this question, we asked some follow-up questions about what that actually entailed. And so I have a bunch of quotes here. This is kind of an open-ended question where they typed in. These are some examples from Saskatchewan, for example, where they're talking about, providing green space, deferring harvests, shelter belts, stuff like that. You also have more of maybe a cognitive influence here, whereas people start thinking about species at risk a little bit more. In my mind, that could be an actually fairly important one. So if people are starting to think about species at risk when they're doing their day-to-day operations, that can maybe have a pretty big impact down the road in terms of being able to provide habitat and things like that, recover some of these species. And the last one is kind of similar again, but just more awareness of how you can integrate some of these considerations for species at risk or other species into sort of, in this case, cattle management practices. Some examples from Alberta. The first one talks about awareness of species and that type of thing, and also highlights what I was mentioning before about trust, just the need to have really trusting relationships between the landowners and the delivery agents or the organizations that are delivering the program. And this was a good one, I thought, because some of these programs are structured where there's like a biologist who go out and chat with the landowners, and this one just kind of shows how willingness to kind of take recommendations and listen to some of those people a little bit as well. Just a willingness to learn more in a lot of ways about species at risk. Some examples from Manitoba. This is kind of an interesting one that talked about the intersection between some of the stuff with regenerative agriculture. So that's where people are trying to restore the soils and all that kind of stuff, usually with a mix of maybe cover crops and integrating grazing back into cropped landscapes and things like that. So this is kind of an interesting one where they're making some anecdotal observations that are linking regenerative agriculture practices to more observation of biodiversity, birds, pollinators, forage, all that kind of stuff that they're kind of seeing coming back to their land. So that's kind of an interesting one coming out of Manitoba. I didn't include any from BC here just because we only had 10 respondents, so it's hard to say a lot about BC, but anyways, those are just some examples from Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta. The other question that we asked them was the extent that they think their engagement sort of changed the way they view the environmental value of their ranch. So again, this is kind of like that, that decision making, that cognitive type of effect that some of these programs might have. So again, some change, 54% was sort of the highest ranked option. But again, if you look at, the categories that suggest change versus no change of 72% versus 28%. So, a pretty strong majority of the people are sort of are seeing, or I guess suggesting that the programs have sort of changed the way they view the environmental value of the ranch. So again, that's a pretty good thing. It shows potentially fairly significant impact from these programs. Again, just some examples from Saskatchewan. This is interesting. It talks about how they validated their practices and that type of thing, and encourage them to think a little bit more about this this more holistic approach, thinking about the air, soil, water, biodiversity on their operation. I mentioned here quickly too, this whole idea of validating practices, I think is important because a lot of landowners, there's a lot of landowners out there that have been doing the right things for a long time. And sometimes what these programs can actually do is provide a bit of reassurance that somebody out there thinks that as well. Agriculture gets beat up a lot in the popular media and all that kind of stuff. And, so if you can imagine you're somewhere in like rural Saskatchewan or Alberta, Manitoba, or wherever, you've been trying to do things right for your whole career. But every time you flip on the CBC, it's something negative about agriculture. So sometimes these programs actually almost serve as they can help recognize some of the good practices that people are doing. People can appreciate that stuff as well. And I thought this one was interesting. It shows just the whole idea that people started getting excited about species at risk on their landscapes. When I first started this research a long time ago, I went and had coffee with one of the local ranchers, and one of the main things that he was saying is that there's a need to turn species at risk from a liability to people to more of an opportunity. And definitely agree with that. And this maybe shows that in some ways that's happening to some extent. Maybe not everywhere, but definitely in certain cases, people are starting to get more excited about having species at risk on their lands, as opposed to seeing it as something that could potentially get them in trouble down the road. Some examples from Alberta. People are more aware of the impacts of their decision they're having on all species that are on their land. So it kind of shows, again, that perspective change a little bit. And this one was also interesting, just like that idea of more willingness to share the land with different wildlife species. And, that idea of sharing land is kind of core to this idea of a working landscape. So that's a pretty impactful change as well. And from Manitoba, this one was kind of interesting. Thinking about the farm as part of a broader ecosystem. Sometimes you can imagine a landowner thinks about their parcel quite a bit, right, or their little patch, or their little piece of this ecosystem. But this one kind of demonstrated a broader kind of recognition of how that parcel fits within a broader ecosystem, which is definitely interesting. And this one starts talking about just how through the management, they're seeing more biodiversity coming back, similar to the previous example, but just showing how maybe some of that, once things start coming back, people actually start to think more about these ecosystems and what they were like before we were farming them. So that's all I had for you today. Definitely have time for some questions, and yeah, just thanks again for listening to me here today. There's both my email address and my Twitter handle. If you ever want to interact, feel free to reach out. And yeah, maybe I'll turn it back to Ian to kind of moderate the questions.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy.
No worries.
All right. Okay. One of the questions we have here is, what kind of organizations are involved with CMAs?
So
where I am in Alberta, there seems to be more programs to restore habitat, not conserve what's there. Landowners I work with often mention this.
What was the last part there, Ian?
It's just saying that landowners that I work with often mention that there's more programs to restore, but not as many to conserve what's there.
Yeah, that's I'd say I would agree kind of broadly. When you start thinking about the species at risk programs specifically, I think there's maybe a few that are popping up that are maybe looking to conserve what's there. They're funding things like stewardship, a little bit more of existing rangelands and stuff like that. So like organizations in Alberta, for example, that be involved with CMAs, that's things like Cows and Fish, Multisar, those kind of groups. In Saskatchewan, there's a lot of like South Divide Conservation Action Program, Simply Ag. They've been pretty big in doing some of this stuff. Manitoba would be Manitoba Habitat Heritage Corporation. In BC, I'm actually not too sure myself. I think that these types of CMAs are more just getting off the ground and haven't necessarily been applied too much. But the people that we worked with out there on this survey were the BC Cattlemen's Associations. They're a little bit interested in maybe potentially applying some of these things out there. And yeah, I would agree. There's probably over time and throughout history, there's maybe a little bit more out there that's geared towards restoring than protecting. And I would say especially in the context of species at risk, where we need to protect habitat, critical habitat, all that kind of stuff. There maybe one kind of message out of this is the need to kind of flip that balance maybe back a little bit more towards protecting and that type of thing, or stewardship on habitat and that type and those types of things. I think it's also related to that point I was making about the need to kind of validate and recognize good practices, right? And so if you've been out there and you've been doing a good job for a long time, you've been, you're kind of a steward of your lands, there's species at risk out there. There's probably still a need for some kind of public program to recognize that, and that can be pretty important because it kind of lets you know that you're doing the right thing, and it lets you know that the public knows that you're doing the right thing, right? One of the questions that we asked on the survey, I didn't present it here. I'm still kind of digging through the data on this one, but we asked people how much they think participating in the programs affects the public's perception of what they're doing. And where we're getting a lot of positive responses to some of these other questions, that was like a negative one, right? And people were really sometimes it's a bit disheartening when they're doing all this good stuff and the public doesn't recognize it. And I would say, that's potentially part of that whole idea of, we focus a lot on restoration, but not necessarily on recognizing and protecting landscape, or the rangelands that are already out there.
The second part of the question is, when will this work be published?
I'm working on it, yeah. So as fast as my fingers can type. But so we just closed the survey, finally closed it around the end of last year. Yeah, so I've got sort of a rough draft. I like to present my work a little bit before I publish it, just to get people's feedback and stuff like that. So I'm presenting it here. I presented it on Monday to a crew, or a similar webinar series out of York University, and I actually presented this a couple weeks ago to the Species at Risk Advisory Committee at the federal level. My plans, so I'm going to be at the Prairie Restoration Transboundary Grasslands Workshop in Regina here in a few weeks. So I'll present this again there. And then I'll move more towards publishing it. When you think about peer review in the process, hopefully it's out sometime maybe late summer, early fall, something like that, just because it has to go through like a peer review process. But the other thing that I would mention is we just actually closed, the survey just closed last week or a couple weeks ago, but we applied the same questions. Working with WWF US, we applied the same questions in Montana, Nebraska, and South Dakota. So we're going to have some kind of transboundary stuff to compare as well.
Okay. Are there any other questions for Jeremy?
Kind of on that last note, if you want a copy of my survey, or I guess of the results before the publication comes out, just send me an email. I can send you a PDF of my slides.
All right. Well, Jeremy, it looks like we are at the last of our questions. I appreciate you taking the time to present today.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
If anybody else has questions for Jeremy, please feel free to contact either Jeremy or John Pattison-Williams, and he will forward the questions on to Jeremy, and I'm sure Jeremy will get back to you as soon as he can.
Definitely.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for the February PHJV webinar. We'll see you next month. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Yep. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Goodbye.